Gains is a complete and utter piece of...
Name is Richard, last name Burgess.
I'm a sadist. I enjoy hurting people.
My YouTube channel's Vegan Gains. I'm a vegan animal rights activist.
The only use I can see getting out of you is cutting your fucking skin off and turning you into my new
and that's what most of my content centers around, but I also do health and fitness and political stuff and social issues. You'd know that my grandfather recently died of a heart attack. I was planning on showing you guys footage of my grandfather actually having the heart attack. As soon as the paramedics got to the house, I took out my camera and started filming. But a bunch of people in my family, my mom, my grandmother, uncles, shit like that, they threw a big fucking fit about me showing that footage on YouTube. They're perfectly fucking fine with eating foods that cause fucking heart disease and make people actually die of fucking heart attacks. But when it comes to actually showing people what happens when they eat these foods, that's just too much.
You're against killing animals, but not innocent humans? I'm a retarded who listens to fucking TikTok propaganda videos. Think of the children. Congratulations, banned. Say that to my face in public, motherfucker. Come up to my face. If you see me in public, I don't care if it's a fucking restaurant, say that shit fucking face and see what happens. Bring your fucking kids with you, say that shit to my fucking face.
Maybe some of it's the autism. I don't really have much of a filter. It's like your kid's picking up your shitty fucking habits, dude. Yeah, maybe you'll die the same way, a fucking heart attack or something.
See more yo-yo videos.
Oh, Jesus. Is this like what, like, you're proud of your son for this? Like, he must have been actually proud of his son for being able to do this. Holy crap. Your kid's a loser. Yeah, so John Meadows was promoting this idea that saturated fat is healthy. And I mean, he died for what he believed in. He ate like shit. He was also on cholesterol-lowering medication, so his doctors, yeah, they knew his cholesterol was way too high. And I just thought it was funny that this guy who was promoting, you know, eating shitty foods died of, you know, the result of eating those shitty foods. So that also kind of pushed me in that direction of like laughing at his death. And I don't see that sort of death as tragic.
It's very insensitive to say that about him, you know?
Yeah, I don't care.
You don't care.
I want to lead this conversation by saying I have nothing but respect for veganism as a whole, but it's people like Vegan Gains who are overly aggressive and the feral monsters in his comments section that really give vegans a bad rap and a negative reputation in the world.
These are loaded. It's 10 grams of essential aminos, 7 of which are BCAAs. So I think that's probably the most preserved.
Like it just blows my mind that this guy did a fucking interview talking about how vegans can't get enough amino acids, and then he has a fucking amino acid supplement that he takes.
That I've seen.
So blah blah blah. Cancer is an almighty killer, and I wish there was a cure for it. I, for one, will be supporting Team Lewis in the future, and hope you guys will too. One day, cancer will be a thing of the past, and the memory of Lewis will live on in the cure when it's found.
Steroids are vegan, dumb fuck, just because you did a stupid fucking Google search where you asked some stupid fucking AI chatbot doesn't mean you don't know fucking shit. The fact that you're even using a fucking AI means you're a fucking idiot. I'll fucking show you how fucking vegan steroids are. I'll drop you on your fucking head.
To some, Vegan Gains is one of the most hateful men on YouTube. A man who has built an entire career around attacking people over his love of animals. A man who has laughed at the deaths of public figures. Someone who has openly admitted to thoughts and impulses that most people would never dare discuss publicly. But to others, he's one of the most compassionate and admirable people in the fitness space today. A man who has dedicated years of his life to defending animals and his beliefs. Someone willing to sacrifice friendships, business opportunities, and even his own reputation for a cause that he believes in. Two completely opposite perspectives on one human being. And the crazy thing is, both perspectives have merit. Both sides have their receipts. So who exactly is Vegan Gaines? A sociopath? An activist? A victim of childhood trauma? A man whose worldview was shaped by autism? Or perhaps a person whose diet and lifestyle altered his personality? Or is the truth far more complicated than any of those explanations? The interesting thing is, the deeper you dig into the story of Vegan Gaines, the harder it becomes to place him into the neat little box that so many want to see him in. This isn't a story about veganism. It isn't a story about bodybuilding. And it's definitely not internet drama. It's the psychological autopsy of Vegan Gaines. A story of a boy who grew up surrounded by humiliation, fear, depression, and powerlessness, and the man he eventually became. To understand who Vegan Gaines truly is, we have to look back. Back before the controversy, back before YouTube, before the bodybuilding, and even before veganism. Back when Vegan Gaines was known simply as Richard Burgess. Every psychological autopsy begins with the same question. When did the story actually start? For some, it's a specific traumatic event. A death, a divorce, perhaps a betrayal. Any major turning point that divides life into a before and after. But Richard's story is unusual because some of the traits that define him seem to appear before his earliest memories even began. What's one of your earliest childhood memories? For Richard, it wasn't a birthday. It wasn't a family vacation. It was fear. More specifically, a fear of babies. And not a mild discomfort, a genuine phobia.
I fucking hate children. They literally make me sick. When I see babies in a commercial, I start to gag and almost throw up, and I have to look away and mute it. And when I see babies in a stroller, especially when they're crying, I just want to put my foot through the thing and it until it's nothing but on the pavement.
Richard was disturbed by virtually every aspect of them. The bald heads, the oversized eyes, the tiny fingers, even the noises they made. The exact opposite of what most people experience when they see a baby.
There's this clip of you
it's
where
not
you're
a
like,
hatred, it's a fear.
you have a fear of babies.
Yeah.
There's this clip where you're like, I want to put my foot through the fucking thing.
Yeah, that was a joke.
Well, obviously, but what do you not like about babies?
They're just creepy as shit and they scare me.
What does that mean? It's like a cute little baby, you know? It's like,
They're not cute. They have like these weird bald heads, bulging eyes, creepy little toes and fingers. Yeah, they just creep me out and they make really annoying sounds.
so you would never want to have kids.
Nope.
They weren't cute, they weren't innocent, they were unsettling. At first glance, this sounds like a meaningless detail, but it becomes more interesting when you realize it may be one of the earliest examples of a pattern that would follow Richard throughout his life. A feeling that he was experiencing the world differently than the people around him. At the time, that difference probably seemed insignificant. But years later, those same traits would become part of one of the most controversial personalities the fitness industry has ever seen. That pattern appears again when we look at Richard's views on parenthood. Many people eventually develop some level of paternal or maternal instinct. Richard claims he never did. Not at 6 years old, not at 16, not at 26. Just not at all. In adulthood, that conviction became so strong that he actually underwent a vasectomy while his wife underwent a hysterectomy, permanently removing the possibility of ever having children.
Creep me out, and they make really annoying sounds.
So you would never want to have kids?
Nope. I have a vasectomy, and my wife has a hysterectomy, so it would be literally impossible for us to have kids.
Do you think if you had a kid, you would come to love it?
No.
No.
I don't think I have any paternal instincts.
That's crazy. I thought everyone kind of had that. That's interesting.
Yeah,
Has it always been the case, like since you were young?
Yeah, even when I was like when I was old enough to be lucid, so probably like around 3, 4, when your memories start to form.
Yeah.
Really creeped out by babies.
That's so odd. That's interesting.
Now, to be clear, choosing not to have children isn't unusual. Millions of people make that decision every day. What is unusual, however, is how early and how consistently Richard appears to have known. Long before most children have any concept of parenthood, he already felt disconnected from the idea. Now, none of this proves anything. It doesn't prove autism. It doesn't prove a personality disorder. It doesn't prove a psychological condition of any kind. But it does raise an interesting question. What if the Richard we know wasn't simply shaped differently by his life experiences? What if he was experiencing life differently from the very beginning? Richard has speculated that he may fall somewhere on the autism spectrum, despite never receiving a formal diagnosis. That doesn't make it true, but it's worth examining.
You mentioned autism. Or do you actually have autism, or do you just suspect?
So I've never been officially diagnosed, but I've taken some like basic tests online. I did talk to a psychologist friend of mine years ago, informally. He thought I might have it. And
like Asperger's, or?
Yeah, maybe. I don't know what type. And my wife thinks I might have it. Like, she knows me better than anybody. Yeah, there's just some weird stuff about me.
If Richard does possess autistic traits, it could help explain certain patterns that repeatedly emerge throughout his life. His intense fixations, his rigid moral framework, his tendency to follow an idea to its conclusion regardless of how uncomfortable that conclusion makes other people. It also might explain his preference for logic over social approval. These are all themes that will continue to appear throughout this story. But labels aside, one thing is clear. Richard often felt different from the people around him. And for a child, that can be an incredibly isolating experience. Because being different isn't always the problem. Not understanding why you feel different often is. But feeling different was only the beginning. As Richard grew older, life would introduce a much bigger challenge. Pain. Not the kind that comes from injury. The kind that comes from simply existing. And in Richard's case, that pain arrived far earlier than it does for most people. Many people can point to a specific moment where life became difficult. A breakup, a death, maybe a betrayal. Some tragedy that arrived unexpectedly and just changed everything. But Richard's story is unusual because his suffering appears to have started before he was even capable of understanding what suffering was. At just 6 years old, Richard had thoughts of ending his own life. And the most disturbing part isn't simply the age at which it began, it's how he describes it.
I have had depression my entire life for as long as I can remember. Even when I was only 5 or 6 years old, I remember distinctly that I did not want to live, and I was actually planning out attempts. So it's not like I was just sad for a few weeks or a couple months and then it got better. This was a lifelong thing that has been affecting me for about at least 30 years. And I have also been on a bunch of medications. I was on SSRIs, SNRIs, NDRIs, antipsychotics, you name it. Those medications did give me some temporary relief. They might have worked for a couple months where I felt normal, but again, they'd lose effectiveness. I'd go back into depression, and it might have even been worse than before I tried the meds. And they also came with a bunch of side effects, and some of them were quite dangerous, especially the antipsychotics.
He doesn't describe depression as sadness. He describes it as pain.
How does that depression manifest? Is it like self-doubt or just not wanting to do anything?
Lack of ability to feel pleasure from anything, lack of motivation, exhaustion, and just like this feeling of, it's hard to explain, but it's just this feeling of constant pain from existing. Gotcha. And I just want it to end.
And you had that for a long time when you were a kid?
Yeah, ever since I was about 6 years old.
And you're doing better now thanks to medication?
Yeah.
Would you say that you're not depressed now?
Yeah, right now. I'm not depressed.
Okay. Despite the meds, do you get that way sometimes?
Yeah, sometimes.
Okay.
Yeah, it can pop up.
But it's not as a result of like adversity or something happening. It's more just like a mood.
So some things have triggered it for sure. Like I've had issues with the police that triggered depression. I know that for sure, but it can just come and go. Things can be going great for me. Like I'm making a lot of money. I'm not even having to work that hard. Things are just going smooth, and then I can just get super, super depressed.
A constant pain that came from just existing. An invisible weight that followed him everywhere he went. And it was a feeling that never truly left. He's spoken about experiencing profound exhaustion throughout much of his life. An inability to enjoy things the way other people seemed to. An inability to experience pleasure the way others did. Today, his condition is treated with medication. But for most of his life, this was a normal, everyday struggle. And that's important, because when suffering becomes normal, it changes the way a person relates to the world. Most people spend their lives trying to avoid pain. But what happens when pain becomes your baseline? When discomfort isn't the exception, it's the default setting. Unfortunately, this reality isn't unique to Richard. Many people live this way, and the effects can vary dramatically from person to person. For some, chronic suffering creates fragility. For others, it creates resilience. And in some cases, it creates something else entirely. Numbness. Because eventually, the mind adapts to that pain. Not by eliminating it, but by becoming familiar with it. And when we look at Richard as an adult, we see someone who regularly says things that shock people.
Did any of you hear the horrible news? Furious Pete got cancer again! That cancer is a preventable illness that is caused by animal products and can be treated through a Whole Foods vegan diet. Well, Pete and his dumb bitch girlfriend don't seem to like that idea. In Pete's mind, torturing and killing animals is okay, but educating people to the fact that eating animals is both unhealthy and cruel just isn't acceptable. But fortunately for all of us, but not Pete, it doesn't matter if you disagree with science because science will always be correct. And it seems I was correct because Pete got cancer again. Oh, so sad. And before you all start calling me a sociopath as some sort of attempt to insult me, how about you consider the fact that Furious Pete makes fun of the suffering and death of the animals he eats on a daily basis. So I don't see why I shouldn't make a joke about his suffering and death. So who would like a, haha, you're gonna die of cancer t-shirt?
Someone who appears largely unaffected by criticism. A man who seems unusually comfortable discussing death, suffering, and tragedy in ways that many people find unsettling. Now, the easy explanation would be to assume that he simply doesn't care. And to many people, that's exactly how he comes across. But another possibility exists. What if he stopped being shocked by pain a long time ago? What if years of depression fundamentally altered his relationship with suffering itself? Because when suffering becomes normal, the things that cause others fear begin to lose their power over you. Rejection means less. Embarrassment loses its sting. Being disliked becomes very easy to tolerate. And death can even begin to feel less distant. And that appears to be a pattern that we'll see throughout Richard's life. Pain is inevitable. Suffering is normal. And survival means learning to live with both of those things. But pain and depression weren't the only challenges waiting for Richard. Because while he was fighting an internal battle that few children could ever understand, another battle was unfolding around him. One that would shape his confidence, insecurities, and perhaps even his sense of self-worth. And that battle wasn't being fought in a classroom or on a playground. It was fought inside a hockey rink. While depression was the battle being fought inside Richard's mind and body, hockey was the external fight shaping his everyday reality. For many children, youth sports become a source of confidence, a place to make friends, learn discipline, a place where parents cheer from the stands and help build a child's self-esteem. But for Richard, it was something very different. Hockey became one of the first environments where he learned that failure came with consequences. Not just physical ones, psychological ones. No encouragement, no comfort, and no validation. Instead, his efforts in the rink became a source of criticism.
What was your family life like?
Yeah, I got into, it's a pretty hostile environment growing up. I had some pretty crazy hockey parents. So,
Really into hockey?
Yeah, I had to do a lot of training, had a lot of pressure on me. And if I just didn't play well, I was kind of shamed and humiliated by my parents.
Like in front of other kids? How would they shame you?
No, it was usually in the car ride home, just for fucking straight hour, them saying I played shit. There's no point in them supporting me playing anymore because I suck, that sort of crap.
Do you feel bad about that? Do you think it gave you a thick skin? Do you appreciate your upbringing or?
No, that was definitely not a good thing.
Not a good thing.
You suck. You played like garbage. According to Richard, he was told there was no point in supporting him if he wasn't winning. And while some parents believe harsh criticism builds character, psychology suggests something more complicated. You see, children don't just learn what their parents teach them. They learn what their parents repeatedly communicate. So if the message becomes, "You are valuable when you win," many children eventually internalize something much darker. "If I lose my value." Now, to be fair, we only know this story from Richard's perspective. His parents aren't here to provide their version of events. But what matters most isn't whether every detail is perfectly accurate. It's how Richard experienced it. Because perception shapes reality. And according to Richard, these experiences left insecurities that followed him well into adulthood. But Richard also acknowledges something interesting.
You feel bad about that? Do you think it gave you a thick skin? Do you appreciate your upbringing, or
No, that was definitely not a good thing.
not a good thing? Do you think it shaped how you are now?
I'm sure to some degree. I think I tolerate a lot of things pretty well because of my upbringing.
Like talk online?
Yeah, like talk online.
Gotcha.
So to some degree, it might be helpful, but probably overall not great. I think it gave me insecurity issues.
The same experiences that made him feel inadequate may have given him the thick skin that later allowed him to survive internet fame. Because when you step back and look at the broader picture, most people could never endure the amount of criticism that Vegan Gains receives online. The insults and mockery, the reaction channels and clippers, the endless commentary. Yet Richard often appears remarkably unaffected by all this. And perhaps that's because internet criticism feels different when you've already spent years being criticized by the people whose opinions mattered the most. The experiences that appear to damage Richard often seem to strengthen him at the same time. The same environment that creates insecurity can also create resilience. The same criticism that hurts him can make him harder to break. But hockey may have shaped Richard in another way as well. Because beneath the criticism was something even more important: powerlessness. Think about the position he found himself in. A child, desperate for approval, dependent on adults and unable to defend himself. A child whose worth seemed tied to his performance. Now, whether that was his parents' intention or not, the effect may have been quite profound. When approval becomes conditional, children begin living in fear of losing it, and fear has a way of shaping identity, especially when it's experienced over and over again. Now, at this point in the story, the pattern isn't fully visible yet, but the pieces are beginning to fall into place. Hockey wasn't the only environment where Richard encountered authority used in destructive ways against him. Far more troubling examples were waiting for him at home. And at the center of those experiences stood a man whose shadow would stretch across multiple generations of his family. A man Richard would later describe as both the kindest person in the room and the most damaging influence of his life. At the same time that Richard was being put down by his parents for his lack of performance, there was another figure casting a shadow over his entire life: his grandfather. And if hockey taught Richard about criticism, his grandfather taught him about fear. According to Richard, his grandfather wasn't just difficult or strict. He was physically and emotionally harmful. Not just towards Richard, toward the entire family. The stories Richard tells aren't the stories of a family that occasionally argued. They're stories of people who were genuinely afraid. Afraid enough that decades later, they still carried the psychological scars.
I've had a lot of issues with my grandfather. He was pretty abusive to me.
Like physically?
A little bit physically, like he's hit me a few times, but a lot like mentally and emotionally.
Okay.
And he was a scary guy. Even like my mom and my uncles, so his kids, they would talk about having like nightmares about him throwing like explosive glass at them and shit. So like he was kind of a scary, intense dude. It's a bit of a love-hate relationship though. He's kind of like the nicest asshole you could ever, meet. I think he was mistreated a lot as a kid, and he would do things to kind of like make up for that, like make sure you get every Christmas present you want. So I think he meant well, but yeah, I just had relationship issues with him for sure.
Family members experiencing reoccurring nightmares about Richard's grandfather. The trauma permanently burned into their minds. Nightmares that persisted long after childhood ended and adulthood began. And that's the frightening thing about trauma. The event might end, but the nervous system doesn't always get the message. Part of you continues living as if the threat is still there. And perhaps the strangest part of Richard's description is the contradiction. Because according to Richard, his grandfather wasn't a monster 24 hours a day. He could be generous. He could be charming. He bought gifts for people that he loved. He created moments of warmth. And then, without warning, he could turn around and inflict emotional devastation on those very same people. Psychologically, that kind of unpredictability can be incredibly confusing. Not just for children, even for adults. Children naturally want clear categories. Safe and unsafe, good and bad. But when someone alternates between affection and abuse, those categories begin to collapse. The person causing fear becomes the same person offering comfort. And the person creating pain becomes the same person handing out rewards. Children can spend years trying to make sense of this type of contradiction. And what's remarkable is that decades later, Richard would still be wrestling with those feelings. In fact, one of the most controversial decisions of his entire life would happen when his grandfather was dying. Now, what's particularly interesting is how often themes of power, control, and exploitation appear throughout Richard's worldview later in life. When Richard talks about animal rights, he rarely frames the issue as a matter of personal preference. He frames it as a matter of domination. And when viewed through the lens of his childhood, that fixation starts to feel less random. Now, none of this means Richard became an activist because of his grandfather. Human beings are far more complicated than that. But when we examine the issues that seem to affect Richard most deeply, cruelty, bullying, exploitation, abuse, and the misuse of power, it's difficult to notice the overlap, as though some part of him never stopped reacting to the same fundamental problem. As Richard entered elementary school, those lessons about fear and powerlessness were about to follow him into a completely different environment. One where authority figures failed him, one where bullying flourished, and one where the anger that had been quietly building beneath the surface would finally begin to reveal itself. By the time Richard entered elementary school, two things were already clear. First, he was struggling internally in ways most children can't understand. And second, he didn't seem to fit in. He was the weird kid, the autistic kid, the kid who always seemed slightly out of sync with the people around him.
What kind of kid were you? How did kids see you?
Yeah, I was like the autistic kid who was weird, had few friends, but they were quality friends, that type of thing. I really butted heads with teachers a lot. Didn't usually have too many problems with students, but teachers got into a lot of fight with teachers.
As mentioned, Richard has never received a formal autism diagnosis. So we can only speculate when it comes to this. But it's speculation rooted in observation, not only by Richard himself, but by people close to him. His wife believed he had autistic traits. A psychologist felt like he had autistic traits. And so did Richard. So despite not having a confirmation of autism, the question is worth exploring because it may help explain certain patterns that appear throughout his life. Many people on the autism spectrum describe feeling as though they're observing social rules rather than naturally understanding them, as if everyone else received a handbook to life that they simply never got. They often report difficulty understanding social nuance, sarcasm, unwritten expectations, and group dynamics. At the same time, many develop strong attachments to logic, consistency, and fairness. And when you look at Richard's adult personality, those traits immediately stand out. His arguments rarely appeal to popularity, tradition, or the social norm. Instead, Richard tends to approach issues like mathematical equations. If this action causes unnecessary suffering, and unnecessary suffering is wrong, then the action is wrong, regardless of how many people disagree, regardless of how uncomfortable the conclusion becomes. For better or for worse, that type of thinking defines much of Richard's public persona. But as a child, it likely made his life extremely difficult. Because schools are social environments that reward conformity. You have to read people. You have to navigate group dynamics. You have to understand rules that aren't always spoken. And children who struggle with those things often find themselves isolated. And isolation creates vulnerability, especially when bullies enter the picture. For Richard, that bully was a boy named David. But David wasn't physically intimidating. In fact, Richard describes him as smaller than he was. But bullying isn't always about physical strength. Sometimes it's about social leverage, manipulation, and psychological pressure.
I really butted heads with teachers a lot. Didn't usually have too many problems with students, but teachers got into a lot of fight with teachers.
What were those fights like? Like, what were your issues with them? Was it over like the academic curriculum? Was it over just like petty stuff?
A lot of petty stuff. I think I've had some racist teachers.
Really?
Because they seem to have like picked on me specifically.
Okay.
There was one teacher in grade 4, I think her name was Miss Fraser. She literally looked like that teacher from South Park, the fat ugly chick that replaced Mr. Garrison.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, she would kind of single me out in class. Like if anybody was talking, like if it would always be me that got like told to shut up. And there was this kid named David in the class, white kid. He would tease me and stuff, and he tried to bully me, but he was like way smaller. So
in like a racist way, or
no, I don't think he was racist. Like he would just try to bully me, but because he was smaller, he had to do like stupid, like steal stuff from me, like steal my pencil case.
Yeah.
And he would lie to the teacher and say that it was like his stuff that he was stealing. And then the teacher would always side with him. So there's no particular reason why she would always side with him that I can think of other than, yeah.
According to Richard, David would steal his belongings and then deny it. And when teachers became involved, Richard felt they consistently sided against him. Now, whether that perception was accurate or not, the effect was the same. The authority figures responsible for protecting him weren't protecting him. According to Richard, the teacher involved repeatedly dismissed his concerns. And for someone who already possessed a strong sense of fairness, that kind of experience becomes difficult to tolerate very quickly. Because unfairness wasn't simply happening, it was actually being validated. Historically, when children repeatedly experience situations where authority fails to intervene, they often develop one of two beliefs. Either nobody will protect me, or I have to protect myself. And soon we'll discover Richard leaned heavily towards the latter. And the way he chose to protect himself would soon reveal just how much anger he had been building beneath the surface. What happens next may be some of the darkest moments we've encountered so far. Not because of what Richard did, but because of what he was willing to do. Every psychological autopsy eventually arrives at a moment where the audience is forced to confront an uncomfortable question. Not what happened to a person, but what was happening inside that person, inside their mind and inside their heart. And for Richard, those moments arrive shockingly early in life. At just 9 years old, he wasn't merely dealing with bullying at home and at school. He was experiencing thoughts that most adults would find deeply disturbing. And perhaps even more disturbing than the thoughts themselves was the honesty with which he describes them. Many people spend their entire lives hiding the darkest parts of themselves. But Richard talks about them openly, almost clinically, as though he's dissecting someone else's mind. Remember David? He and Richard were sent together to retrieve files from the principal's office. They found themselves alone near a high railing, several stories above ground. And that's when Richard grabbed David by the throat, lifted him over the railing, and held him there, suspended above the drop. David panicked, begged and pleaded, and according to Richard, he remembers savoring that moment. Not necessarily because he enjoyed the suffering, but because for the first time, the balance of power had completely reversed.
Yeah, I almost killed him.
You almost killed him?
Yeah.
What does that
grade
mean?
4. Yeah, the teacher one time told us to go pick up files from the principal's office.
Yeah.
And they had like the buddy system. So for whatever reason, she knew I hated him, but she had me and him go down. And it was, I think, a 4-story building, 3 or 4 stories. and right at the top of the railing, and it was like straight down from the railing, grabbed his neck, hung him over the railing, and I was gonna throw him over and kill him because I didn't like him. He was begging and pleading for his life. I was savoring the moment for a while, and then I guess like some synapses in my brain started firing, and I figured I probably won't be able to get away with murder. So I just spared his life.
No one caught you or anything?
No, he didn't say shit. I think he was too afraid or something.
He thought you were gonna...
I almost shot him with a bow and arrow too.
So what was this bow and arrow thing as well? Are you an archer?
Yeah, I did archery since I was like pretty young, like probably around like maybe 6, 7, 8 years old, something like that. And there was like this class project thing with Native Americans and pilgrims and shit. And this is pre 9/11, so you know, things were more lax, you know, so I brought the bow and arrow as part of my like Native American character, and I had actual arrows. So I just knocked an arrow. I was gonna just shoot him because, like, again, I don't like him, and I wanted him to see his death coming. He wasn't paying attention, so I said, "Hey, David." So he looked over. He freaked out, and like he was like, "Oh my God, help!" And I just, like, again, just synapses in my child brain started going, and I'm like, probably go to jail for this or something.
How old were you when this happened?
So it's grade 4. I think I would have been like
9.
9-ish.
You were 9. He must be so afraid of you to this day. He's probably terrified of you.
The boy who had made him feel helpless was now completely helpless himself. Eventually, Richard pulled him back, but the explanation he gives for why he didn't let him go is what makes the story so unsettling. It wasn't empathy, it wasn't guilt, and it definitely wasn't compassion. He simply realized that he wouldn't get away with it. And whether that memory is perfectly accurate or distorted by time doesn't really matter, because psychologically, the story reveals something important. Richard wasn't just angry. He was consumed by the desire to take back control. Later that same year, Richard brought a real bow and arrow to school as part of a project. At one point, he drew back the bow, loaded an arrow, and aimed it directly at David. He called out his name. He wanted him to look. He wanted him to see what was coming. But once again, Richard stopped himself. And the reason wasn't emotional. It was practical. There would have been consequences. His life would have been destroyed if he released that bow. Now at this point, some viewers will be asking a pretty obvious question. Was Richard a psychopath? It's a tempting conclusion, but I think the reality is more complicated than that. Children who experience chronic humiliation, bullying, trauma, social isolation, depression, or emotional neglect can develop extraordinary amounts of anger. And sometimes that anger becomes terrifying, anger that feels impossible to express safely, an anger that is constantly searching for an outlet. Now, that doesn't excuse the violence, but it does remind us that human beings are rarely that simple. What's particularly fascinating is that these stories don't fit neatly into any one category. On one hand, Richard openly admits to thoughts that many people would never confess. And on the other, much of his later life becomes devoted to protecting vulnerable creatures from harm. Those two realities seem contradictory, but as we'll see, they may not be contradictory at all, because Richard's life was about to take a turn that would make those feelings even more complicated. As he entered his teenage years, he discovered something that would permanently alter the balance of power in his life: physical strength. And for someone who had spent years feeling vulnerable, that discovery must have felt transformative. If there's one chapter in Richard's story that feels almost symbolic, it's bodybuilding. Because by the time he entered his teenage years, Richard had already spent much of his life feeling powerless. Powerless against depression, against authority figures, bullies, and circumstances that he just couldn't control. Until he found bodybuilding. For many people, bodybuilding is just a hobby, a way to stay healthy and improve their appearance and challenge themselves. But for others, the gym becomes something deeper, a place of transformation, a place where weakness is slowly replaced by capability, where insecurity can be hidden beneath the muscle that you build, and a place where someone can totally reinvent themselves. And we've actually seen this same thing in more than one of our psychological autopsies found on this channel. It's a reoccurring theme. Larry Wheels went from a scrawny, neglected child into an unstoppable force of nature, even if it was to his own detriment. And we saw a similar situation with David Lade, who went from a lanky, bony child with no stability in life to an icon who ended up becoming a victim of his own success. These are just two examples of people who used the gym to create armor, a shield to protect themselves from the outside world. Feel free to check those videos out. They're on the channel.
I've been vegan for 13 years. I can guarantee that I'm bigger, stronger, healthier than probably 99% of your audience.
Yeah, you are scary. For anyone in real life who's watching this, I don't know if you can tell. We might look kind of the same height right now because he's kind of slouched over, but he's like, you're like what, 6'2"?
6'3".
6'3", 250-ish pounds. Yeah. And in the gym, he can lift like, I think I saw you bench like over 300 pounds.
Yeah.
I've never seen anyone bench that in real life, so it is pretty crazy.
Yeah, my best bench is 380.
Do you see that as like a crowning achievement?
Yeah, like I'm pretty proud of that. I wanted to bench 405, but I have that injury in my elbow.
Do you think you'll get to 405 or no?
Yeah. It'll just have to wait for a while.
What's the ultimate goal for you for weightlifting?
I want to bench 405. That's my biggest goal. I also want to get my squat up to 500 pounds.
Once you get there, is there any number that will satisfy you?
I always want to improve. So I might have other interests down the road. I have developed other interests aside from weight training before. So I got into road cycling for quite a while. Mm-hmm. So my interests might change, but for right now, as a long-term fitness goal, yeah, those are numbers I want to hit. Okay.
What's the ultimate goal of your channel? And I guess your life right now as someone who, like, you get called a clout chaser a lot. I don't think you're that. I see why people don't like you, but to me, you come across as someone who sacrificed a lot of personal connections or success you could have had in exchange for your lifestyle. I mean, certainly there are much larger weightlifting channels than you that are not vegan, that don't say the things you say. Even in this podcast, you've been overly candid in a way that I didn't really think you would be. I thought you would hold back a little bit, but you seem like totally, like, I put, you're like a computer. Like, I put a question into the computer, it instantly tells me. There's no, reservations. There's no like thinking about it. It's just like, oh, that's what I think. I'll say it right now.
Yeah. I think honesty is extremely important. Honesty is something that I value a lot, and I have nothing to hide. Mm-hmm. So yeah, if you ask me something, I'll answer honestly.
Do you think that everyone should be like everyone should be honest about everything?
Absolutely. White lies might be okay. Like, I lie to my wife about doing the dishes. Yeah, I'll do it later.
Same.
But yeah.
Actually, I don't even lie. I just say I'm not doing it. Yeah. Yeah. The dishes suck.
And while we can never know exactly what bodybuilding meant to Richard psychologically, it's difficult to not notice how perfectly it aligns with many of the struggles he'd already experienced. The child who once felt powerless was becoming capable. capable of defending himself, and perhaps defending others. Now, one story from this period stands out above all the others. A former friend had stolen from Richard, and that same individual had also kicked a dog, and that was the final straw. One day, Richard decided to level the playing field.
You mentioned there was one time when you like brutally beat some kid.
Yeah.
When you were still in high school still?
Yeah, this was high school. Think I would have been about 16, 17.
Okay. And you were into lifting by that time?
Yeah.
Were you pretty jacked or were you trying to go more lean?
For my age, I would have been pretty jacked.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this kid, what was your beef with him? Was he your former friend or something?
Yeah, he was kind of like the Cartman of a friend group I had. And I lent him video games that he stole, and I saw him kick his dog, and then I just beat the crap out of him.
Jesus. And you just like confronted him outside of his house? He was just there?
He was just there smoking cigarettes, and I happened to be there, so I just beat his ass.
Damn. That's crazy. Like, it wasn't like a premeditated thing you were thinking all day. You just happened to be driving by.
Yeah, I just happened to be walking by, saw him. Yeah.
Beat his ass and just walked away? That was it? And you felt no remorse or anything for that?
No. Think he got what he deserved, but like, again, I was younger, and I had really, really bad anger issues.
Right.
He approached the kid, beat him to the ground, and just walked away. What makes the story significant isn't the violence, it's Richard's reaction to it. Or more accurately, his lack of reaction. No remorse, no guilt, and no regrets. From his perspective, the individual had harmed a defenseless animal and also harmed other people. And that individual received exactly what they deserved. And when you view it through that lens, bodybuilding starts to take on a different meaning. Because maybe the gym wasn't only about aesthetics. Maybe it wasn't only about performance. Maybe it wasn't even primarily about bodybuilding. Likely, on some level, it was about protection. Now you might be thinking, come on, Joey. Plenty of people lift weights for reasons that have nothing to do with trauma. And you'd be right. Many people train simply because they enjoy it. But when you look at Richard's life as a whole, it's difficult not to ask the question, was he building muscle or was he building armor? Now, the subscriber who actually inspired this documentary asked a fascinating question. Could Richard's physical transformation be connected to his childhood experiences? That possibility is absolutely worth considering, because strength solves many of the problems that people fear. Strong people are harder to intimidate, harder to victimize, and harder to control. Strength creates options. It creates confidence and security, protection. And for someone who spent years feeling unsafe, those very things can become incredibly appealing. But while bodybuilding may have transformed Richard physically, another experience was about to transform him psychologically. An experience involving death, or at least what he believed to be death. And unlike the gym, this transformation couldn't be measured in pounds or inches, but it would fundamentally alter the way he viewed his life forever. Most people spend their lives avoiding thoughts about death. People fear it, and so they distract themselves from it. They push it into the background of their minds. And that's completely normal. Death is the thing waiting at the end of the road that most people would just rather not think about. But Richard's relationship with death appears to be very different. And that difference began very early in his life. So before we continue moving forward, let's briefly return to Richard's childhood. As a child, Richard suffered from severe asthma. One day, while riding his bike, his throat suddenly began to close. The air stopped coming, and breathing became impossible. And for the first time, he genuinely believed that he was going to die. There was no rescue, no dramatic intervention, no reassuring adult to arrive at the last second to save his life. Richard recalls sitting down and accepting what he believed was inevitable. And then everything went black. Eventually he woke up. He was alive. But this wouldn't be the last time Richard would come face to face with what he believed was death. And the next encounter would leave an even deeper mark.
I had asthma as a kid. It can go away, like it can improve over time.
Yeah.
Don't think I have it really anymore. A lot of kids, I've heard, like, so I played hockey. I heard the refrigerators that they use for those old ice rinks, they have like ammonia spilling out of them, and that can trigger asthma. But yeah, I almost choked to death. I was riding my bike, my throat just closed up, and I just sat down, couldn't breathe, figured, well, I guess I'm going to die now. And then I just woke up.
Experiences like this have ways of changing people, especially children, because most children live with the assumption that they're invincible. Death is something that happens to other people, old people, people in movies, people who feel far away from them, not to themselves, not today. But when a child genuinely believes they're going to die, that illusion can disappear in an instant. And once it's gone, it hardly ever comes back. Years later, Richard would experience something even more dramatic. At 18 years old, he developed a severe E. coli infection in his knee. The situation became serious enough to require multiple surgeries, powerful medications, and heavy painkillers. During treatment, Richard was given enormous amounts of medication in an attempt to address the complications he was facing. He eventually overdosed. According to Richard, he believes he came dangerously close to death. And what happens next sounds less like an overdose and more like a profound altered state experience.
What led you to become a vegan in the first place? From what I understand, you ate meat till you were like 20?
Well, no. Again, I turned vegan just before my 19th birthday.
Okay.
So
you were 18.
Yeah. So I think there were two things that really led to it. One was a near-death experience that I had when I had an E. coli infection in the hospital. I think I overdosed on opiates. So I had multiple surgeries to try to flush out the infection in my knee. So I was put under. I was on the highest dose of morphine they could give me, and the nurses gave me OxyContin and Percocets. And this is all in one day.
Oh, so you must have been in extreme pain.
Yeah, I was in insane pain. And I think I took so many opiates, I had a near-death experience. And I remember actually feeling my heart slow down and then leaving my body. And then I became the universe. It was like this really weird out-of-body experience. I think that made me just a little more empathic because I felt like I just became everything.
Richard felt himself leave his body. He describes becoming one with everything, a sensation of connection and unity. It was an experience that he later interpreted as deeply meaningful. Now, whether that experience was neurological, chemical, spiritual, psychological, or some combination of all of these things, is impossible for us to know. But from a psychological perspective, that's not the important question. The important question is what Richard believed happened and how that belief affected him afterwards. Because the stories people tell themselves about major life events often become part of their identity. And this experience appears to have changed him forever. He describes it as having expanded his empathy, and altering the way he viewed existence itself. And perhaps more importantly, it completely removed his fear of death.
Well, that near-death experience, that didn't seem to bother you that much that you were about to die.
No. Yeah, no.
Like death doesn't faze you?
Nope. Yeah, I've never been afraid of dying.
Well, what about like all the stuff you'd leave behind in this world, you know, all the stuff you like, people you like?
Yeah, that doesn't bother me.
It doesn't bother you at all.
Like, you're going to be dead. Like, we're all going to die eventually, so what are you going to do?
When we look at Richard's adult personality, that detail becomes incredibly important. Because fear of death influences far more than mortality. It can influence behavior, risk-taking, social conformity, even a person's willingness to challenge authority. All these things are influenced. For example, people who fear death intensely often become cautious. People who stop fearing death, however, can become very difficult to intimidate. And Vegan Gains comes across as someone very difficult to intimidate. Public backlash doesn't stop him. Criticism doesn't stop him. Threats don't stop him. He doesn't care if you like him or not. Even legal consequences have rarely stopped him from expressing exactly what he believes. Now, whether that's courage, recklessness, conviction, or some combination of all of those is completely up to you to decide. But one thing seems clear. Richard's relationship with mortality is different from that of most people. And if you've spent your life wrestling with depression while confronting death more than once, it's possible that many of the things that terrify other people simply lose some of their power over you. But while these experiences changed Richard's relationship with death, they still hadn't answered a much larger question. What exactly was he supposed to do with his life? What cause was worth dedicating himself to? What belief was powerful enough to organize all the anger, conviction, and intensity that had been building inside him for years? And the answer would arrive shortly before his 19th birthday. And once it arrived, it would change the direction of his life forever. Up until this point, Richard's story feels fragmented. Depression, bullying, family trauma, isolation, bodybuilding, near-death experiences. Each piece feels connected, yet disconnected at the same time, as though the puzzle is slowly taking shape, but the full picture still isn't visible. Shortly before his 19th birthday, something changed. A friend showed him a speech by an animal rights activist named Gary Yourofsky. According to Richard, the effect was immediate.
Slow down, and then leaving my body, and then I became the universe. It was like this really weird out-of-body experience. I think that made me just a little more empathic, because I felt like I just became everything. And then a couple years later, a friend of mine at the time, who later became a very bitter enemy, he shared a video called "The Best Speech Ever Told" by Gary Yourofsky, animal rights activist. Mm-hmm. And after seeing that, I just had no excuse not to go vegan. So he argued that there's no ethical justification to eat animals. It's bad for your health, bad for the environment, just bad in every way. So just right then and there, chose to go vegan.
Gotcha.
All right. Hello, everyone. Looks like we're live. I'm joined here with the one and only Gary Yourofsky. This is the guy who turned me vegan, I think about 15 years ago. Scary question and sports/farm. There you go. So, yeah, I came across one of your speeches about 15 years ago. And a friend of mine at the time, he was in the fitness industry. He was like a fitness model competitor, bodybuilder. He came across your speech. He shared it on his Facebook. And he said, wow, after watching this, I'm never going to eat meat again. So I thought that was interesting. And I knew about veganism, like I heard the term, but I didn't exactly know what it was. Like I didn't get it. No one really explained it to me. Like I knew they didn't eat any animal products of any kind. So it wasn't just vegetarianism, but they also didn't eat eggs, milk, nothing. I didn't understand that because, I was just completely ignorant. I didn't know like how bad dairy was, how bad eggs were. But like I could understand, the idea of not wanting to harm animals. I actually was considering going vegetarian eventually. Like I was really into athletics and I thought, maybe once I was done sports, like I'd go vegetarian. So I was already kind of interested. So, I clicked on the link, watched your video, and one thing really stood out to me near the beginning of the speech where you said, as children, we love animals. We had stuffed animals, our pet dogs, cats, we love them. If we ever saw anybody as children harming, an animal, we'd kick and scream and freak out. And that really made me realize, like, I wasn't living in line with my values. And right away, like, I immediately took you seriously and listened. And, it was shocking seeing not only how bad the, meat industry is, but it also blew my mind how bad eggs and dairy were. And you also, dispelled the myth that, like, you can get as much protein as you need, all the vitamins, minerals, stuff like that. That was also a myth, that, I wasn't around any vegans, to tell me otherwise. So right then and there, I realized I can live in line with my values, and there's only benefits. I'm only going to be healthier, probably live longer, and, I can train, build muscle, all the same. So that day, right after watching your speech, I went vegan, and I also showed it to my mom. She actually went vegan with me. So me and my mom turned vegan that day after watching your speech. So that was really great. And then, I became an activist and everything, and the rest is history.
He listened to the arguments, considered the logic, and came to a conclusion. If unnecessary suffering is wrong, and eating animals causes unnecessary suffering, then participating in that system is wrong. For many people, ethical decisions involve balancing competing values. You have traditions, you have cultures, family, convenience, your personal happiness. But Richard doesn't appear to approach moral questions this way. He tends to approach them through logic. A conclusion is either consistent or inconsistent, defensible or indefensible. And once he believes he has reached the correct answer, he rarely appears interested in compromise. For Richard, veganism wasn't simply a dietary change. It became a moral conclusion. And once that conclusion was reached, turning back would have felt intellectually dishonest. Now, what's particularly fascinating is that many critics point to veganism as the explanation for Richard's personality. And at first glance, that assumption makes total sense. After all, most people encountered Richard after he became Vegan Gains, during the activism and the controversy and all the public outrage. But when we examine the timeline, that explanation becomes very difficult to support. The depression came first. The social isolation came first. The violent fantasies came first. The feelings of being different, the childhood trauma, the insecurity, the anger, all of it came first. All of it existed before veganism ever entered the picture. In many ways, veganism appears less like the beginning of the story and more like the moment everything found a direction. a place for Richard to channel ideas and emotions that had been building for years. When Richard encountered animal rights, he wasn't becoming a different person. He was finding a cause that aligned with his values, the values that he already possessed. Protection, justice, opposition to suffering. Think about the pattern that we've been following for this entire story. His grandfather, the bully at school, the authority figures who failed to protect him, the friend who kicked the dog. Again and again, Richard seems to react most strongly to situations where power is being used against someone weaker. And then he encountered factory farming, a system involving billions of animals that are completely dependent on human beings. Animals that can't organize, they can't advocate for themselves, and they can't fight back. So whether you agree with Richard's conclusions or not, it's not difficult to see why that issue would resonate so deeply with someone whose life appears filled with examples of the strong harming the weak. When viewed through that lens, veganism begins to look less like a sudden personality change and more like a continuation of themes that were already there. The powerlessness, the vulnerable, and the question of who should protect them. And perhaps for the first time in Richard's life, those values had a clear target. Because for Richard, animal rights weren't separate from human rights.
So I see veganism as a logical extension of human rights. So if you're going to claim that animals
aren't humans.
Well, listen. If you're going to claim that animals shouldn't have similar rights as human beings, like a right to life, you're going to have to point out a morally substantive difference between humans and animals. And I've never seen anyone point out a morally substantive difference.
They appear to have been an extension of the same moral framework. And from that perspective, vegan gains begins to make much more sense. We're finally beginning to understand the framework through which Richard sees the world. A framework that would eventually transform him from a private individual into one of the most controversial figures in fitness. But before we understand the controversies, we have to understand a deeper question. Why animals? Why did they affect him so profoundly when human suffering often seems to affect him very differently? The contradiction sits at the center of Richard's public identity, and understanding it may be the key to understanding him. At first glance, Richard's worldview appears contradictory. One moment he sounds compassionate. The next he sounds ruthless. One minute he's expressing concern for animals, and the next minute he's making statements that leave viewers wondering whether he even cares about humans at all. For years, critics have pointed to this contradiction as evidence that something doesn't add up with him. How can someone claim to care about suffering while appearing so indifferent to human suffering? And it's a fair question, but maybe the answer isn't that Richard loves animals more than humans. The answer just might be that he responds differently to different forms of suffering. Because animals occupy a unique place within his worldview. They are completely dependent on the decisions of human beings. And it seems that this appears to be morally intolerable to Richard. Not because animals are perfect or special or anything, but because they're vulnerable. In many ways, his philosophy seems to revolve around a very simple question. What obligations do the powerful have toward those who can't protect themselves? And once Richard reaches that moral conclusion, he's willing to follow that wherever it leads. Doesn't matter if people hate him for it. Doesn't matter if it damages relationships, if it ruins his reputation. It doesn't matter. This may help explain why Richard often appears less concerned with social approval than the average person would be, especially the average YouTuber. Most people instinctively avoid conflict. They'll soften their language, they'll compromise, but with Richard, he does the complete opposite. If he believes something is true, he says it, and often bluntly, many times offensively, and often without much concern for how the message will be received. Now, whether autism plays a role in that tendency is impossible to know, but one thing that seems consistent throughout Richard's life is that logical consistency appears to matter more to him than social acceptance. And that's very interesting, because the same traits that make him seem principled to supporters can also make him seem extreme to his critics.
I think most of us would see the most preferable outcome being the fewest animals having their rights violated, being abused, murdered, human beings benefiting, lower rates of chronic disease, lower rates of mental health issues like depression, anxiety, living longer, and living better, more enriching lives where we can live alongside animals kind of as guardians or companions rather than abusers or, manipulators or slave owners.
Yes.
And I think when you just envision a world that you really want to see, you just have to use your executive function in your brain and kind of map out, how do we get to a world like that? And I don't see how you can get to a world like that without adopting a vegan lifestyle. If you keep paying for animals to be abused, you go to McDonald's, eat like crap, you keep supporting these corporations that are just, it's literally a holocaust. Animals are getting put into gas chambers and killed so that you can have a bacon cheeseburger. People are also being damaged by this. We know all the bad health effects of animal products, especially processed food. And we know the environmental outcomes. We're losing so much agricultural space due to animal products. A lot of wildlife is getting destroyed due to the animal agriculture industry. There's global warming, which is very much contributed by the animal agriculture industry. So if we all want a better world where humans and animals are benefiting as much as possible from existing, veganism is definitely the way to go.
It's wild. The same traits that fuel the activism also fuel many of his controversies. It's a paradox, and nowhere is that paradox more obvious than when we examine Richard's relationship with empathy. Because while he demonstrates enormous concern for vulnerable animals, he openly admits that human suffering affects him very, very differently, which raises a question that sits at the center of his public identity. Is Richard unusually compassionate or unusually detached? And perhaps the craziest thing is that the answer could be both.
I don't know how to eat food!
How can somebody care so much and so little at the same time? It's the contradiction that has confused supporters and critics and even casual viewers of vegan gains for years. Because when most people think of compassion, they imagine something universal. Compassion for friends, strangers, animals. Compassion for anyone who is suffering. But Richard doesn't seem to experience empathy in a way that fits neatly into that framework. In fact, he openly admits it.
Well, I guess the thing that confuses me the most is you seem to, you have very high empathy for animals, in large, I see you post like white girl pictures of cats on your Instagram, which is cool. I like that. But like you do, like you're like, oh, the cat's so cute, whatever, all this. But then like with people, like if they fuck up a little bit, like you get like very, very angry. Obviously more manageable now, but to the point where you beat one kid up and then, you know, this other kid 2 times, you almost, you know, ended his life at like age 9. So it's just a little bit like, it seems like a weird sort of cognitive dissonance to me. But you seem very, very empathetic to animals.
Yeah, like I'm even still, I can tell that I don't have quite as much of a problem with causing pain. So like, you know, if you have to clip an animal's nails or say they're injured in some way, you have to like get them out of a fence or something. I'm not as bothered by it as like normal people having to cause pain in the interest of helping somebody, whether it's a human or an animal. Again, I don't internalize other people's pain the same way normal people do.
Does gore bother you?
No.
Not at all.
Yeah, I don't internalize these things the same way most people do.
Over the years, Richard has repeatedly stated that human suffering often affects him differently than it affects other people. For example, war doesn't seem to impact him emotionally in the way that it impacts many, many other people. Medical procedures don't seem to bother him. He's even given the example that if he needed to cut off a person's foot to save their life, he could do it without experiencing any emotional distress. That's not something that many people would be capable of. Statements like these have led many people to ask an obvious question. Is Richard a psychopath? Maybe a sociopath? Someone fundamentally lacking empathy. And that's an understandable question to ask. But human beings are complicated. You see, the problem with the psychopath theory is that other aspects of Richard's behavior don't fit neatly into that box.
Psychopaths and sociopaths. When do we say a person is a psychopath? According to Oxford Learner's Dictionary, a psychopath is a person who has a serious personality disorder that involves not caring about other people's feelings, not feeling sorry when they have done something bad, and wanting to be violent or cruel to others. Children who exhibit callous unemotional traits, lack of empathy and guilt, shallow emotions, are more likely to grow up to be psychopaths. These kids tend to engage in aggressive and antisocial behavior, such as bullying. They are also less likely to recognize a frightening look and are less likely to react to socially rewarding stimuli, like pleasant expressions. Teenagers that exhibit early traits of psychopathy, like lack of empathy, may also be diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. They are also less likely to make lifelong friends, since they cannot find delight in these bonds. Psychopaths are typically unable to establish true emotional connections with others. They tend to form superficial bonds that they later use to their benefit. And despite the obvious harm they cause, psychopaths never regret their actions. They typically create a symbiotic or parasitic connections and can be almost compulsively ordered while maintaining the appearance of normalcy in their social interactions. So what really makes these people enjoy manipulating others? It turns out that dopamine, a chemical that awakens our brain's reward centers, is overproduced and overvalued in the brains of psychopaths. Why do psychopaths think that influencing others will make them feel good? Their dopamine receptors go into overdrive, providing them with motivation and considerably enhancing their desire to get their own way. Psychopaths typically provide 100% effort. Since they are so motivated by rewards, they have a very strong positive attitude. Instead of concentrating on the potential downside, they emphasize on the potential upside, which drives them to exert more effort because they only perceive the benefit. If things don't work out their way, they may go to extremes. Pathological lying is a trait that many psychopaths exhibit. They could embellish the truth to forward their agenda, boost their ego, or influence others to think, feel, or act in a certain manner. The majority of people with normal emotions experience remorse or at least some level of concern when they lie. But for psychopaths, lying is guiltless due to the lack of conscience. Deception is indeed a recognized symptom of psychopathy, and it can even manifest as someone faking regret, empathy, or care and concern for others. Sociopathy. According to the Oxford Learner's Dictionary, a sociopath is a person who has a mental illness and who behaves in an aggressive or dangerous way towards other people. Are sociopaths made? The word sociopath is used when antisocial behavior is brought on by a brain injury or harmful sociocultural elements such as parental neglect, peers who engage in criminal activity, belief systems, and upbringing. They are majorly a product of their surrounding environment. They have little conscience. Sociopaths are not all cold-hearted like psychopaths. They do have the ability to feel remorse and guilt, and although empathy and guilt can exist in sociopaths, they usually lack the strength to override their impulsive and erratic conduct. Meanwhile, their connections might sometimes feel normal, at least with those they are close to. Highly impulsive. When a sociopath commits a crime, they may do so on the spur of the moment, and with little thought to the risks or repercussions of their choices. They may easily become agitated and angry, which could lead to violent outbursts on occasion. The likelihood of catching a sociopath rises as a result of these actions.
Psychopathy is often associated with manipulation, self-interest, exploitation, using others as tools. Yet Richard has spent years dedicating enormous amounts of time and energy and personal reputation to animal rights, a cause that provides very little personal benefit. And he's willingly made himself unpopular. He's invited criticism and sacrificed opportunities, all in the pursuit of something he genuinely believes is morally important. Now, that doesn't automatically disprove psychopathy, but it does complicate the picture. So perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Maybe the question isn't whether Richard lacks empathy. Maybe the question is how his empathy operates. Because empathy isn't a single thing. Psychologists often separate empathy into different categories. Emotional empathy is the ability to feel what someone feels. And cognitive empathy is the ability to understand what someone else is experiencing. A person can possess one while struggling with the other. And when Richard describes himself, that's often what emerges. Not necessarily a lack of understanding, but a lack of emotional resonance. As though he can intellectually comprehend suffering without emotionally absorbing it. And if that's true, it would explain a lot why criticism appears to affect him less than most people, why he can discuss human tragedy in ways many people find unsettling, why he sometimes says things publicly that others would never dare say or even think. But when animals enter the conversation, something changes. His intensity returns, his outrage comes back, the passion is there, the protective instincts return. And that's what makes Richard so difficult to categorize. Most people fit into familiar boxes. You're either a hero or a villain. You're compassionate or you're cruel. But he doesn't fit comfortably into any of those. He's basically too compassionate to easily be dismissed as a monster, and too controversial to comfortably be described as a hero. So instead, he occupies that uncomfortable middle ground, where conviction and controversy constantly collide. And perhaps that's why one story from later in Richard's life feels so psychologically revealing. When his grandfather was dying, the same grandfather who had terrified family members, whose behavior left emotional scars throughout his entire family for their entire lives. Well, when that moment finally arrived, Richard brought a camera. He wanted to film his grandfather's passing.
Alright, so if you've been following me on Facebook, and if you've seen my last Q&A video,
you'd know that my grandfather recently died of a heart attack. And I just got back from the funeral thing that we had. It wasn't exactly a funeral, but a bunch of family got together and I was dragged to it. But anyway, I was planning on showing you guys footage of my grandfather actually having the heart attack. As soon as the paramedics got to the house, I took out my camera and started filming. But a bunch of people in my family, my mom, my grandmother, uncles, shit like that, they threw a big fucking fit about me showing that footage on YouTube. They're perfectly fucking fine with eating foods that cause fucking heart disease and make people actually die of fucking heart attacks. But when it comes to actually showing people what happens when they eat these foods, that's just too much. So
For many people, that sounds pretty shocking, cruel, even disturbing. But Richard didn't describe it as revenge.
I didn't post it to YouTube.
Okay.
My family stopped me from doing that.
But you would have, I guess.
Yeah, I would have.
Okay.
So the real reason I've had years to think about it. I've had a lot of issues with my grandfather. He was pretty abusive to me.
Like physically?
A little bit physically, like he's hit me a few times, but a lot like mentally and emotionally.
Okay.
And he was a scary guy. Even like my mom and my uncles, so his kids, they would talk about having like nightmares about him throwing like explosive glass at them and shit. So like he was kind of a scary, intense dude. It's a bit of a love-hate relationship though. He's kind of like the nicest asshole you could ever, meet. I think he was mistreated a lot as a kid, and he would do things to kind of like make up for that, like make sure you get every Christmas present you want. So I think he meant well, but yeah, I just had relationship issues with him for sure. And me filming his death was kind of a catharsis to kind of deal with some of those like feelings I had about him.
Yeah.
Really, if I could do it over again, I would have just confronted him about it.
Yeah. That seems healthier.
Yeah. But if I could have done it over again, I would have confronted him about it when he was still alive.
It seems like at the time your justification was like, oh, he ate like shit. I knew he was going to die because he ate like shit. Is that also part of it?
Not really. Like I kind of saw his death coming.
Was that like your cope at the time was like, oh, I'm doing it because he's not vegan? But the reality is like you had bad experiences with him?
Yeah.
He described it as catharsis, a way of processing something that had never truly been resolved. Now, whether you agree with that explanation or not, this story reveals something very important. The grandfather's influence didn't end when Richard became an adult. That emotional weight remained. The unresolved feelings never went away. And that's because childhood experiences have a way of following us. Sometimes for years, sometimes for a lifetime. And as time went on, Richard's convictions only grew stronger. The stronger those convictions became, the less willing he became to moderate them. And before long, those convictions would place him directly in the crosshairs of controversy, law enforcement, and an internet audience who couldn't decide whether he was a visionary or a menace. Every belief has a price. The stronger the conviction, the higher the price tends to be. And by the time Richard became Vegan Gains, he had developed one of the most uncompromising belief systems in the entire fitness industry. Not because he wanted attention or controversy, but because he genuinely believed that he was right. And history's filled with people who made life very difficult for themselves because they believed that they were right. Conviction is an interesting thing. It can be a strength, and it can also be a weakness. It can inspire people and also at the same time isolate them. It can create movements and inevitably enemies. And for Richard, It definitely did both of those things. As his channel grew, so did the controversy that surrounded him. The fitness industry is filled with people promoting diets centered around meat, dairy, eggs, and animal products. And Richard wasn't interested in politely disagreeing with those people. He saw those recommendations as harmful, not only to human health, but to animals. And because he viewed the issue as a moral emergency rather than a lifestyle preference, his approach was often very extreme. And this is where many viewers first encountered Vegan Gains, a man willing to say things that made other creators uncomfortable, someone willing to become hated if he believed hatred was the cost of telling the truth.
Well, the goal is to turn people vegan. And I know I rub a lot of people the wrong way, but that's just who I am. And this is my personality. This is how I talk and do things. I think a lot of people, jive with that and respect it. A lot of people don't. So I can't please everybody when it comes to activism and make everybody my friend. So I just be myself.
Like, you get called a clout chaser a lot. I don't think you're that. I see why people don't like you, but to me, you come across as someone who sacrificed a lot of personal connections or success you could have had in exchange for your lifestyle. I mean, certainly there are much larger weightlifting channels than you that are not vegan, that don't that don't say the things you say. Even in this podcast, you've been overly candid in a way that I didn't really think you would be. I thought you would hold back a little bit, but you seem like totally, like, I put, you're like a computer. Like, I put a question to the computer, it instantly tells me. There's no, reservations. There's no like thinking about it. It's just like, oh, that's what I think. I'll say it right now.
Yeah. I think honesty is extremely important. Honesty is something that I value a lot, and I have nothing to hide. Mm-hmm. So yeah, if you ask me something, I'll answer honestly.
Critics multiplied, reaction channels appeared everywhere, and entire communities formed around discussing Richard or condemning him. But criticism only works as a deterrent when someone fears it, and public hatred never seemed to affect Richard the way it affects most people. You guys remember John Meadows? After John Meadows passed away from heart-related complications at the age of only 49, Richard made comments that many people considered deeply offensive.
There was someone...
John Meadows you're talking about.
Yeah.
He had a heart attack.
He had a heart attack and died.
Yeah.
Okay. Why did you, I guess, laugh at his death? What about it was funny to you?
Yeah, so John Meadows was promoting this idea that saturated fat is healthy. So he was claiming butter is a health food, palm kernel oil is a health food, very high in saturated fat, and that you should stay away from these poly and monounsaturated plant fats.
Do you think he believed that for real?
Yeah. And I mean, he died for what he believed in, clearly.
Was he young? How old was he?
He was fair. Like, I think he was still in his 40s when he died. So he wasn't that old. He was on steroids. I'm sure that might have contributed to it. This was also during COVID. So COVID might have also contributed to it. But he ate like shit. He ate a diet very high in saturated fat. He was also on cholesterol lowering medication. So his doctors, they knew his cholesterol was way too high. And I just thought it was funny that this guy who was promoting, eating shitty foods died of, the result of eating those shitty foods. On top of that, he actually agreed with the ethical principles of veganism. He made a few videos talking about how he doesn't like seeing animals killed. He feels bad about eating meat. So that also kind of pushed me in that direction of like laughing at his death. This is a guy who, even though he recognized what he was doing was wrong by his own admission, he kept doing it. And I don't see that sort of death as tragic.
I guess a lot of people would say like, well, it's very insensitive to say that about him,
Yeah, I don't care.
You don't care. You would say it, you recognize it is insensitive.
Well, it's insensitive to pay for animals to be murdered. So I don't have any sympathy for somebody like that.
You see, from Richard's perspective, he wasn't reacting emotionally. He was just reacting ideologically. He believed that Meadows had promoted behaviors that contributed to his own demise. And because Richard often prioritizes logical consistency over social expectation, he expressed that belief publicly. The backlash was immediate, but Richard didn't back down. Another controversy involved accusations that he mocked a child that had cancer. But Richard strongly disputes this, and according to him, his criticism was directed at the adults involved, not the child.
So there's a strong man named Eddie Hall. On his professional Facebook page, he was promoting this fundraiser for a child who has cancer. Now, to me, it seemed as though he was exploiting the situation and this kid so that he could make himself look better. And he didn't really care about this kid with cancer. That was just what I thought. I could have been wrong, not saying I'm right, but that's what I thought.
I guess a lot of people would say, like, well, even if he is exploiting him, I mean, the kid still gets benefit, you know, if he raises money for him, right?
Yeah, but that wasn't really my area of concern. My concern was this guy is exploiting somebody who is going through something bad for his own benefit, even if it benefits the person ultimately. And people turned that into, oh, you're making fun of a kid with cancer. No, I was criticizing somebody who I thought was taking advantage of a kid with cancer.
Yet once again, the situation illustrates a reoccurring pattern. Richard often communicates in ways that prioritize the argument itself over how people will emotionally receive it. Sometimes that produces clarity. Other times it produces disaster. And then there were the legal battles. At one point, Richard's online statements became serious enough that law enforcement actually took notice. Police were monitoring his content. Authorities viewed some of his comments as potentially threatening. Eventually, he was arrested, his home was raided, and he underwent psychiatric evaluation.
Yeah, so I lived in Toronto. Toronto police really don't like vegan activists in general. And they all watch my YouTube channel. I think like every precinct in Toronto was watching. There would be cops that'd come up to me and recognize me and say, oh, hey, Vegan Gains, what's up? Like our entire department watches your videos.
So they must be afraid that you're going to kill someone.
No, there were just some people who just wanted to fuck with me basically, or maybe misunderstood something I've said. So the first time I had an issue with the police where they broke down my door, arrested me, it was under the Canadian Mental Health Care Act, where I'm a danger to myself or others. I said something to the effect of meat eaters deserve to die because they're killing animals, and it's an opinion. And they just broke down my door, arrested me, made me get a mental health exam. And the second time I had an issue with the police, it was really fucked up. The cop actually admitted that he lied to a judge. And he knew I had a BB gun, and I made a joke with a BB gun because I accidentally bought a pair of leather gloves. So I got the BB gun, said I bought a pair of leather gloves, bang. That was the joke. So he lied to a judge, claimed I had a real gun, got a warrant, and then arrested me, fucked with me. And I just had this whole legal rigmarole for 2 years.
Did you get fired?
No, couldn't prove it. None of it was recorded. So
when was that?
That was, I think 4 years ago, 5 years ago.
Later, another legal battle emerged involving allegations surrounding a BB gun that authorities reportedly treated as something far more serious. The result was years of legal stress and conflict. And most people would have viewed those experiences as warning signals. They would have become quieter. They would have become more cautious, less willing to push boundaries. But Richard just remained Richard. And that's what makes this chapter significant. Not the controversies themselves, but the fact that none of them fundamentally changed him. Throughout this story, we've watched Richard encounter depression, family dysfunction, bullying, public criticism, and legal conflicts. Yet his core convictions have always remained remarkably consistent, and so have the ways that he's stuck to those convictions. Now, whether that's resilience or stubbornness, that's completely up to you guys. Eventually, one of the most significant battles of Richard's adult life would come to an end. But this was a different battle than all the rest, because for a man who often seemed disconnected from humanity, there was one person who managed to break through that barrier, and losing that connection may have changed Richard more than anyone could have realized. For much of this story, Richard has appeared isolated. Not necessarily physically, but more psychologically. He's separated from people by depression, conflict, by feeling different from those around him, which is why one relationship stands out so much: Jasmine. Because for a man who often appeared emotionally detached from the world around him, this may have been the most important connection of his adult life. Because despite everything we've discussed so far, Richard never appeared interested in a life of endless casual relationships. In fact, he seems to have wanted the exact opposite, which is interesting considering how often he describes himself as someone who's comfortable being alone and generally uninterested in most people.
Did you date a lot before you met your girl?
No. Before I became sexually active, so when I was in my early teens, I always fantasized about like fucking tons of different women. Thought it was hot to like have sex with people you don't really know that you just met. Then when I did it, it sucked ass.
So you were intimate with a few people and then you were like,
yeah.
This is not for me.
Yeah, it's not for me. Then I only really looked for good long-term relationships. And then I met Jasmine online and we just really clicked. And then things just grew and, we eventually got married.
Was it like a dating app? How'd you meet?
No, Facebook. She messaged me on Facebook and we ended up playing Call of Duty together. Yeah, and that's how we first met.
Do you remember what the first conversation was? Like, was it just like, hey, you want to play COD? Or was it like, I love your veganism? Like, what was that like?
No, I can't really remember. I think she said she like watches my YouTube channel, enjoys my content, and just she offered to like, talk and be my friend basically. I had a lot of girls messaging me saying that they want to like meet up to have sex, or like they would make it. I could see, like, read between the lines that they were more interested in sex than like actually a long-term relationship.
You didn't really care for that?
No. And Jasmine, when she messaged me, it seemed like she actually was interested in a long-term relationship. So yeah, I just messaged her back.
Over the years, Richard has repeatedly stated that he dislikes casual dating. He dislikes sleeping around. He dislikes the entire process of meeting new people. For many people, dating's kind of exciting. But for Richard, it seems to have been more exhausting than anything else. And that's a very important detail. Because when someone genuinely dislikes dating, a stable, long-term relationship becomes valuable in ways that go beyond romance. The relationship isn't just a source of affection, it's certainty, stability. It's one less social battle that needs to be fought. According to Richard, Jasmine initially reached out to him as a fan. The two connected through gaming. Conversations became friendship, friendship became a relationship, and eventually, that relationship became marriage. For nearly a decade, Jasmine occupied a unique position in Richard's life, a position very few people ever seemed to occupy. There was trust, connection, partnership. She was someone who understood him and accepted him for who he was. Someone capable of navigating aspects of his personality that others had a really hard time struggling with. And that's what makes this chapter psychologically interesting. Because throughout Richard's life, there appears to be a reoccurring tension between independence and connection. On one hand, He seems remarkably self-sufficient. He's not concerned with public approval, and he's comfortable being alone. On the other hand, even the most independent people seek meaningful connection somewhere, and Jasmine may have represented that connection. Now, it's important not to romanticize this relationship. Richard himself has acknowledged that problems existed early on. Differences in interests, priorities, patterns that became more obvious as the years passed. Looking back, he would eventually describe the relationship as potentially doomed from the beginning, and that raises a really interesting possibility. If Richard truly possesses autistic traits, antisocial tendencies, or simply an unusual independent personality, finding highly compatible relationships may have been more difficult for him than the average person. If that's true, stability itself may have become extraordinarily valuable to him. Valuable enough to tolerate incompatibilities that would eventually become impossible to ignore. Because people rarely remain in relationships for a single reason. Love, habit, comfort, loyalty, fear, hope, you name it. Usually it's a combination of all of these things. Whatever the reasons were, the relationship lasted for years. Long enough to become part of Richard's identity and part of the structure of his life. And when something becomes a part of the structure of your life, losing it forces you to confront uncomfortable questions. Was the relationship actually working, or had it simply become familiar? And I think that distinction only became fully visible once the marriage finally came to an end. For many people, the end of a long-term relationship leads to reflection, and reflection often leads to reinvention. We've probably seen this in ourselves many times. And we would soon see Richard engage in both, because the next chapter of his life would be marked by one of the most dramatic transformations he had ever undergone. And once again, a familiar question would return. When life makes Richard feel vulnerable, why does his response always seem to be become stronger? Divorce is one of those experiences that often reveal things about people they didn't realize they were carrying. The routines disappear, the certainty disappears, and suddenly a person is forced to confront themselves without the structure they've grown accustomed to. Thankfully for Richard, the end of his marriage appears to have been remarkably civil. The relationship had problems. Some of those problems had existed for years, and eventually, the marriage came to an end. On the surface, it's a relatively ordinary story. But what now? What do you do with your time, with your energy, with the uncertainty that you might have? For many people, as we mentioned, the answer is reinvention. You move to a new city, you get a new job, there's a new hairstyle, or you go to the gym and create a new body. You do anything that can create movement in your life that proves that life is still moving forward. Which brings us to one of the most interesting developments in Richard's entire story: steroids. For years, Richard was known as a natural vegan bodybuilder. Then, after the divorce, something changed. Richard entered a new phase, a phase marked by rapid physical transformation. More muscle, more strength, and more size. Now, it's important to be fair here. People use performance-enhancing drugs for many, many reasons. Curiosity, personal goals, or competitive ambitions. Maybe it's a desire to maximize physical potential in general. And his divorce doesn't automatically explain his decision to use steroids. But the timing is very difficult to ignore. Many viewers look at what happened with Richard and arrive at a very simple conclusion. His marriage ended, he reinvented himself, And there might be some truth to that interpretation. Breakups have inspired dramatic physical transformations for as long as people have been falling in love. But Richard's own description of the divorce points towards something more complicated.
Yeah, so I've had a interesting, I don't know if this, I have no idea what that was. Well, I've had an interesting few years. I got married when I think I was 23, 24. I was dating my wife for about a year before we got married, and we just recently decided to separate. And I'm not hurt about it. You know, the relationship kind of ran its course. I learned a lot from the whole experience. Kind of learned that people are the way they are. If you kind of notice, even with younger women, like there's this idea that you can kind of mold them into what you want to be. People are the way they are. And women kind of play these games where they'll act as though they have kind of interest in your type of hobbies and kind of act as though, oh yeah, I want to like, like ride bikes with you or something. I'm big into motorcycles. And then it turns out once you're married and once they realize like, okay, things are locked in, they get very complacent. And I think that's part of why the relationship kind of failed. It was kind of doomed from the beginning, and we just weren't kind of perfect for each other. And yeah, I think being in that kind of situation where you're married and there's a pretty good certainty that you can't just walk out, you know, if things aren't kind of going the way you want them to go, you can't say, I think we're going to part ways. I'm just going to date somebody else. And that kind of makes women complacent. And I've learned marriage is just a bad idea for men. My divorce definitely isn't going poorly. She's not like a terrible person or anything. It was an amicable breakup, so I don't have to pay like alimony. I haven't lost like half my money or anything. So things are going good. As far as life goes, I'm making good money and I get to keep more of my money because I don't have to support my wife anymore. She's got her own place now. So, the only thing I kind of wanted to ask you about was like maybe some stuff on hair and some fashion tips, because two things I'm not great with is fashion. I think I look pretty good when I go out on my motorcycles because I am into like motorcycle fashion. Girls always, when I like pull up at a gas station or when I'm stopping at a restaurant or something, I get a lot of compliments from women saying, oh, your bike looks really nice, or I really like your jacket. But I have no freaking idea, like, I don't know, normal people clothes. And I don't know if you could give me any advice on like hair. My thing here is like kind of.
Okay, I got you. But listen, before we get to that, the looks maxing stuff is surface level things that you can change, right? But we got to talk about the marriage because that's going to play a huge role into your future relationships. So guys try to like gloss over that. So number one, I always tell guys, right? I say before she even becomes your girlfriend, you got to date her for 2 years. And then guys call me crazy.
I think
this kind of stuff.
That's sensible.
Yeah. So you were dating her for a year and then you married her within the year.
Yeah, some of that had to do with it being a long-distance relationship at the beginning.
Why were you in a long-distance relationship? Why were you in a long-distance relationship?
Well, I actually am diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. So there's very few people that I'm genuinely interested in. If I were to do everything all over again, knowing what I know now, I probably wouldn't have bothered, but I don't regret the relationship. I learned a lot. I grew a lot as a person, and I think some of the really good things that have happened to me were due to that particular relationship. So I don't regret anything, but yeah, knowing what I know now, unless like there's very, unusual circumstances, I definitely wouldn't, date a foreign woman again, just because like it's a huge hassle.
Gotcha. Okay, so don't get into long distance relationships.
Yeah.
Number one, date the woman for at least 2 years before you even make her your girlfriend, because you need to see who she really is as a person.
2 years.
He doesn't describe it as the greatest loss of his life. If anything, he often seems to discuss it in the same black and white manner that characterizes much of his thinking in general. And at times, he even seems to be quite relieved that the relationship is over. And so a possibility is raised. What if taking steroids wasn't an attempt to become someone new? What if it was simply another version of something that we've already seen with Richard in the past? Throughout this story, Richard rarely responds to difficulty by retreating. He responds by adapting. When life becomes unstable, he looks for something he can control, something he can improve, something he can build. The gym provided exactly that. It was a mission. It was a direction. So the transformation fits a pattern that has appeared throughout much of Richard's life. It's not a new chapter. It's a familiar response being expressed in a new way. And perhaps that's why I don't view this period of his life as a departure from his story. I view it as a continuation of his story. The depressed child becomes a bodybuilder. The outsider became an activist. The activist became a controversial public figure. The husband became a divorced man, and the divorced man became the largest and strongest version of himself yet. But after all of those transformations, one question still remains. Who is Richard underneath all of them? And perhaps more importantly, what has he been searching for this entire time? At the beginning of this documentary, we asked a very simple question. Who is Richard? Now, at first, the answer might have seemed straightforward. A controversial vegan bodybuilder, an activist, an internet personality known for arguments, outrage, and confrontation. But the deeper we dug, the less simple that answer became. Because underneath vegan gains, we found something more complicated. A child struggling with depression before most children even understand what depression is. A kid growing up around criticism and fear. A boy who often felt different from the people around him. And eventually, a man trying to make sense of all of it. Throughout this documentary, we've explored many possibilities. Could autism have played a role? Perhaps. Could trauma have played a role? Almost certainly. Could depression have shaped the way he sees the world? Absolutely. Could veganism have transformed his personality? The timeline suggests otherwise. Most of the traits people associate with Richard existed long before he ever became vegan. And that leads us to what I believe is the most interesting conclusion. Veganism didn't create Richard. It gave direction to parts of Richard that already existed. It was a cause, a purpose, a mission, and that's why he became so effective at it. So polarizing. Not because animal rights was merely a dietary issue, but because it connected with something much deeper. Something that appears throughout nearly every chapter of his life. The desire to protect. It appears again and again throughout his life. And once you begin looking through that lens, many parts of Richard's life start making more sense. The bodybuilding, the activism, the confrontations, the refusal to back down. Not necessarily because they share the same cause, but because they may share the same underlying motivation. Most people eventually compromise. Richard rarely does. Whether that's courage or stubbornness depends on who's watching. To many, he's compassionate, and to others, he's cruel. To so many, he's principled, and to many more, he's extreme. So perhaps the reason why people struggle to categorize Richard is because he genuinely contains elements of all of these things. He's not the villain and he's not the hero. He's way more complicated than that. He's a person shaped by depression, by isolation and conflict. by purpose. And like so many of us, he was shaped by experiences that he didn't choose to have. The internet often treats people like characters. They fit into a box. They're monsters or saints. But real human beings aren't that simple. And so when you look closely enough, even the people who seem impossible to understand often start making sense. Not because we agree with them and not because we excuse them, but because we finally understand what shaped them. And so after everything that we've uncovered, he had the desire to protect, the desire to stand between vulnerability and whatever was threatening it. And maybe that's why bodybuilding mattered. Maybe that's why the activism mattered. Maybe that's why compromise always seemed so difficult. Because long before Richard ever became Vegan Gains, he was a child trying to understand a world that often felt unfair. And maybe ever since then, he's been trying to become the protector that he never had.